Drowned here. You can sometimes see ghosts underwater. Not many, and not often, but sometimes, like when you're walking from one station to another, or when you're peering through a porthole, trying to catch a glimpse of the fish. They'll be standing outside. Yes, I didn't say floating or swimming. Standing, both feet on the ocean floor, planted firmly, as if they're just standing on your front lawn. But they're not standing on the surface. They're stuck down here with the rest of us, in the dark. You might be wondering, dear reader, how there can be ghosts underwater. I would also like to ask them that question, but they can't answer. We're underwater, and you can't talk underwater. The second you open your mouth, water will rush in, and your lungs will be filled with its burning volume. You drown. They can't drown. They're already dead. That's probably why they're down here. Ships lost, sailors lost, souls lost, lost to the depths, the dark, the darkness. If you see one, you'll know. They don't just stand there, they glow, bright like moonlight, like the bulbs of anglerfish, heavenly among the pitch black, nothingness outside. They're far enough away that the automatic perimeter sensors aren't triggered. Filming them is equally as useless. Nothing works when they're around. Nothing works. Nothing. Including the oxygen systems. And that's the point, isn't it? The reason why they're starting to appear more and more frequently. They've had enough of just looking at us. They want to be able to touch us. Shied Bones. Let me tell you about the story of Shied Bones. A simple description would be he was a bully, just a ruthless son of a bitch who didn't care about anything or anyone but himself. But a more complex description would involve the part where he's also a murderer to boot. Shied was a sailor, tall as a church steeple and as wide as a brick shithouse. Come to think of it, he smelled like one too. I first met the bastard on the Brandywine, a cargo ship going from Pennsylvania to New Orleans. I was the ship's cook, and he was one of the deckhands. Two things stood out when I first met Shied. He was big, and he was an asshole, like I said. As first impressions go, he didn't give two shits about giving off a good one to anyone. He was like a bull in a china shop, purposely elbowing his way past fellow crew members, acting like he was the top cock around the ship, wherever he went, and always picking on crew members he perceived as weak. On this trip, he picked a particular tiny fellow named James Whitley to pick on. James was a tiny, scrawny lad. Think of a toothpick with legs. To be honest, the lad probably had no reason to be a deckhand on a cargo ship, but I'm not going to question how a fella makes a living. Even though this was my first voyage with the two, I had been on enough voyages in my life to know this wasn't going to be a smooth sail to New Orleans. I've been a sailor all my life, and by the time of this first encounter with Shied, I was already 48 years old. These sea-weathered eyes had seen a lot, and I knew that when a bully like Shied picked a target, then that target was in for a rough journey. It didn't take too long for the first encounter on the voyage. It happened the first night during dinner. I served some piping hot chowder to the boys with a ration of bread, and after I served everyone, I fixed myself a bowl and went topside to eat in the cool night sea breeze. I sat my bones down up against the port side rail and began to eat. I looked to my right and saw Tiny James eating his grub. He noticed me and shook his head and said the chowder was delicious. I thanked him and we continued eating our meal. After a minute or so, I heard a big booming voice from James' direction. "Hey kid, that chowder be looking real tasty. How's about you give me the rest of your food?" It was Scheid, standing over James holding his own bowl of chowder, looking down at James with a smart-assy smirk plastered across his face. James hesitantly replied no. His voice trembled as he uttered the word. "You have your own bowl of food. Leave me alone, Scheid," James continued. That took balls from the lad, I thought, but I knew it wasn't going to end well. Before I could finish my thought, Scheid was on James like a lioness on one of them old zebras. He ripped the bowl out of James' hands, and then he kicked James right in the stomach hard as he could. James crumpled into a ball, writhing in pain. Scheid stood there and shouted, "Next time I tell you I want something, that means I fucking want it, boy," and walked off laughing. I sat there for a few moments, then got up and walked over to the kid and handed him the rest of my food. I told him to hang in there. I felt sorry for the kid. Like I said, it was only night one, and it was already bad for the kid. Like I knew it would, it only got worse from there, picking on James daily, taking his food nightly. These abuses went on for weeks. Me and a few others tried warning the officers what was happening and that it wasn't going to end well. They always would say, "We'll take care of it," but they never did. Truth be told, I think they were scared of old Scheid Bonez, as well as the others. Hell, as I sit here in my ripe old age telling you this tale, I'm not afraid to admit I was even a little frightened of Scheid. He was just plumb crazy. Even after months of abuse, some genius gave night watch to James and Scheid, those two together, up on the deck alone. It just didn't sit well with me. I had a very bad feeling as my head hit the pillow. Not long into the night, my fears were realized. When shouts of "man overboard" could be heard from topside, we all quickly ran up to see what was the matter. Scheid was standing there seeming out of breath. Then he pointed to the railing and said James had fallen over. We rushed over to the railing to try and spot James, but we couldn't see him. We lit every lantern on board and still couldn't spot him. I could hear one of the officers shout, "What's this?" We all rushed over to the railing he was standing by. He shined his lantern over the railing and the deck boards right under it. It was covered in blood, big pools of blood. Scheid was questioned and said James was walking over near the railing. He slipped, hit his head, and before he could reach him, he fell over the side of the ship. An officer pointed out that Scheid's knife wasn't in its sheath, but he had an answer for that too. He said he handed it to James to cut some extra rope that was hanging from one of the masts. If you ask me, the story was a crock of shit. But there was no witnesses. Scheid was detained and questioned when we docked in New Orleans, but no one saw anything, so he was released. I personally think he finally killed the poor boy, but there was nothing I could do about it, so that was that. When we returned to Pennsylvania, I tried to forget about Scheid, James, and the ill-fated voyage on the Brandywine. I had taken plenty of jobs on plenty of ships since then. I heard the Brandywine was sold and didn't know what had become of Big Scheid Bonez, and didn't really want to know, to be honest. Then about 10 years after the voyage on the Brandywine, I took a job as a cook on a whaling ship called the Ocean's Revenge. We were to sail all along the East Coast for a few months' time, catching as many whales as we could. As I stood amongst the crew for orientation and roll call, I could hear a big burly voice to the left of me shout, "I'm right here." I looked over and saw it was Shide Bonez, but he hadn't answered to the name Shide. He was going by the name Brom Johnson. But I know it was him. There's no mistaking that big bastard. Doesn't matter if it's been 10 years or not. You can't forget a killer like that. I guess he changed his name so he could get work, or escape the unwanted attention of the incident. Nobody wants to crew with a suspected murderer after all. As roll call ended, and we were dispersing to our stations ready to set sail, I ran into him. He said pardon me and acted like he didn't even recognize me. Now I know it had been 10 years, and I had gotten a little more grayer and frailer, but I hadn't changed that much. I said pardon me as well and started walking towards the galley to get prepared for dinner. But when I turned back, I noticed him staring at me, mumbling something to himself. He recognized me. I knew it was him. He obviously doesn't want the attention of what happened 10 years ago. I made my way back below deck to the galley and kitchen and started getting things ready. As I started preparing the meal, however, I noticed this space had looked awfully familiar. I stood there for what seemed to be forever trying to rack my brain. Then that damn Shide Bonez popped into my head and broke my concentration. That's it, I thought. That's why I know this kitchen. I'm on the fucking Brandywine. I knew this ship looked familiar standing up on the deck. New name, new paint. But this is her. There's no doubt about it. This is the Brandywine. I asked the quartermaster, who's been with the ship for quite a few voyages, and asked him if this indeed had been the Brandywine. And when I asked him, his face turned sullen and serious, and whispered, "Shh, be quiet. Don't say that name." I looked at him dumbfounded and asked why not. He proceeded to tell me that the ship was haunted and the Brandywine was eventually sold and given a new name and painted a new color because people had begun to refuse to sail on her because of the odd, eerie things that happened on each voyage. He swore me to secrecy. He didn't want this getting out and frightening the crew. I agreed and went on about my business. Haunted, I chuckled. I don't know about that. I've never been one of those superstitious sailors, but it was quite eerie being back on the Brandywine. With old Shide Bonez, I must admit. I didn't have time to dwell on such things for long, however. I had a dinner to prepare for. Nice hot beef stew with a roll was on the menu tonight. And dinner came quickly. I served the lads and then went topside to eat in a cool sea breeze. I sat my tired bones down up against the railing and ate my stew, and I looked over to my right. I could make out Shide in the shadows, his face barely being illuminated by the glow of his match as he lit his pipe. It was strange, though. He looked shaken as he struck the match. I could have sworn I saw big Shide Bonez' hand tremble as he put the match to his pipe. Never thought I'd see that sight. I continued watching him in the corner of my eye as he stood up against the railing, eating his stew. He seemed strange acting. He kept looking over his shoulder like he was hearing something. Voices, sounds, I don't know, but he was acting peculiar. I shrugged it off, finished my meal, and went to bed. I had a dream about James when I fell asleep, and how Shide tormented that poor lad. Sometime in the night, we were all awakened by a blood-curdling scream. I quickly got out of bed and rushed up deck. There was already a crowd gathered at the center mast. I pushed my way through the crowd to see what the commotion was, and hanging by a rope tied around his ankle was Shide, or as the fellows were saying, Brom. Whatever the case, it was him, and he was dead. just hanging there with an old rusty knife jammed into his stomach. They cut the rope off his foot and laid him across the deck. His face was stretched out in pain, a face I'll never forget. Then someone pulled the old knife from his stomach. I heard someone say there's a name carved on the handle. I asked what the name was, and the reply chilled my bones. Still does, to this very day. The name that was carved on the old knife's handle was Shide Bones. Flying Dutchman. Who would travel these seas at night? Father and son, who have a destination in sight. They sail these waters as they've done before. Their eyes are trained upon the distant shore. The boy's eyes are wide with fear. My son, what alarms you when the shore is so near? Father, father, can't you see the beast? Dearest child, it's just a cloud of seaborne mist. The child turns pale as a ghost, shivering as if his body is stricken by winds of frost. Yet his insides have caught on fire. Soon his young spirit will surely tire. Clouds gather above the ship in the sky, and the winds let out a scornful cry as they shake the wooden vessel for the amusement of the Sea King, while the sirens start to sing. Come to us, beautiful son of man, to a place where you'll never hurt again. Follow us, lovely child, into the sea, towards a future of never-ending glee. And the boy's heart filled with terror, his little throat letting out a scream of horror, a scream unheard by the infant's father, a cry drowned by the wailing winds and raging water. The freak storm has come to an end. Once the boy is seized by the siren's hand, he is robbed of bodily control, as the vessel still dancing causes the boy to fall. On the shore, the man shrieks, half wild, upon finding out the fate of his beloved child. Grief will surely turn the sailor mad, for his child's skull is split open as he lies dead. Refugees. News reports began spreading the story of a ghost ship which beached itself off the coast of Japan 2 weeks ago. The reports claimed that the wooden vessel, with no means of propulsion, washed ashore containing the skeletal remains of at least 8 people. These remains were so decomposed that it was near impossible at initial investigation of first responders to determine if the remains were those of men or women. Opinions were varied as to the origin of the boat and what possessed the passengers to set sail with no supplies. Theories spanned from escape of political persecution to lost at sea due to storms. However, reason still stood at odds against the general lack of preparation, aside from the ship's seaworthiness. Also, the cause of death itself was a mystery, as there were no signs of struggle or injury. It was assumed all had died from exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Investigators were at a loss as to the extreme state of decomposition, which would indicate the bodies had expired for months, while all other indications would suggest a much shorter time exposed on the open water and untouched by scavengers. Forensic scientists from all over the world worked tirelessly to determine cause of death or other clues to help solve the riddle of these mysterious passengers. 1 week after the ship was discovered on that remote beach, the first cases of illness were reported. It started with the woman who had discovered the ship and had been the first to peek inside. She died within a day of being taken to the hospital. Then the initial investigators fell ill with the same mysterious virus ravaging their bodies. What followed was a virologist's worst nightmare. The virus spread like wildfire to anyone who had been in contact with the ship, the bodies, or those who had. Within a week, 200,000 were reported dead or infected. Inside of a month, entire counties went dark. It spread indiscriminately through all possible avenues, from bodily fluid to airborne transfers. Too late. Across the world from the initial site, an independent investigator determined the origin of the ship. It originated from a small remote fishing village off the coast of South Korea, where the virus must have also originated. The remains were not those of passengers at all, but had been placed in the boat and set to sea in a last vain attempt at banishing the illness. All aboard had been ravaged by the virus, and even in death were highly contagious. It was unknown why the bodies had not instead been burned, but was believed could have been part of the village's traditional burial rites. Official investigation of the village found the few other inhabitants unable to escape the pestilent virus, whose remains were scattered throughout the huts of the small area. The last reports before transmissions went silent showed grainy video from an unknown location of rows upon rows of bodies in mass graves, all reduced in the span of days to nothing but skeletal remains. Adrift. The Colchester slowly made its way north, bobbing up and down in the small swells left over from last night's storm. The Colchester was a large cargo ship. She had been made to cross the Atlantic and make occasional trips around South Africa and into the Arabian Sea. She was currently making her way through the Davis Strait in between Greenland and the northwestern passages of Canada. Brian Altier made his way forward along the port bow. He took his time, inspecting the cargo rigging as he went. Brian wrote down everything in his log, the condition of the cargo, the state of the rigging, and anything else he might notice along the way. When he was finished with his rounds, he would make his report to the captain, as he always did. Brian had finally made his way to the bow. He stood there for a long while, just staring off into the distance and feeling the salty spray against his cheeks. It was at times like these that he often remembered the good old days, the loud, boisterous crew, and the many adventures they had. To some, shipping freight was boring, but Brian loved being on the open sea. It was his true calling in life. He just wished that the old crew was here to enjoy it with him, like in the old days. Brian sat at the stern and ate his lunch, as he always did. It was evening and quickly approaching night when Brian was finally finished with his rounds. He made one final notation in his log and went to make his report to the captain. Brian headed to the mess to see if he might find the captain sitting down for dinner. But when he got there, it was completely empty, not a soul in sight. So Brian made his way to the captain's quarters. The captain needed to hear his report, but the captain's quarters were completely empty. After another futile search, Brian gave up. He went to his own quarters and lay down to go to sleep, as he always did. 3 different fishermen had called in reports within an hour. The Coast Guard arrived and began a search, but this wasn't the first time, and they didn't expect to find anything. Reports had been coming in for years of people seeing the Colchester drifting by with a man standing at the bow. They searched for 2 hours by sea and air. They never found a thing. Brian awoke to a crisp and clear day. He pulled on his boots, checked himself in the mirror, and grabbed his log. Brian headed out to the port bow and started slowly making his way forward, inspecting the cargo and the rigging as he went, as he always did. The Lady in White. Apparently, we are approaching one of the most active parts of the ship, Joey tells me, as we admire some of the set design and makeup the monsters are using. I know, I'm excited to see it, I say. We continue down the dark and narrow passageways of the Queen Mary, my sisters gripping our hands with all their force. Every year during Halloween, the Queen Mary celebrates with elaborate mazes and actors dressed as lost souls of the Grey Ghost. This day was the first in a long tradition for my family and I. We all love horror. My sisters love to scream, and we enjoy watching them scream. The hall goes dark. My sisters scream. Letting us go, they run. That was cool, I say. Not many mazes just leave you absolutely blind for a bit. Finally, the pool area. Joey whispers to me, "This is a spot." Anything draped with the amount of history usually has legend or two behind it. One of them being the pool area. People have stated that the souls of the drowned victims roam the pool area. The Lady in White. She is one of the few that apparently comes out when you speak about her past or her daughter. Joey, now allowing me to lead, placing himself right behind me. We enter the pool area. The lights are dim green, and the pool is covered in mist, probably from a fog machine. As we ventured further, the air around us became really humid. We both began to sweat. The Lady in White apparently appears dressed in some white evening gown, Joey says as we approach stairs leading up to the second floor. To this day, I still get goosebumps when I tell this part of the story. I turn around and don't see Joey. Staring back at me, completely eye level, was a long, gaunt face, almost ethereal. Its mouth stretched wider and wider. I stare into its eyes. I was staring into the dark, infinite abyss. My senses were completely distorted. I became nauseous, unable to blink. I couldn't stop staring. It wanted me. Tears went down my cheek. We didn't really see anything. Where did you girls run off to? Joey asked. I realize now that I am standing outside the end of the maze. You got really quiet near the end, man. You just stopped talking and zoned out. Some things in this world our minds just can't accept or even fathom. There are a whole series of different shades and colors that our eye can't even pick up. I wonder now if it's a deterrent, so our minds don't fall into madness. All I know is that I wanted to see it again. The infinite black abyss. Something about that made me feel nothing. It was nice. I waited until next year to try again, but the first floor pool area is now off limits to the public. They never gave me a reason. Tiamat. Tiamat lived up to its name. Named after a Mesopotamian sea goddess, the 660-foot-long behemoth submarine, once armed with nuclear torpedoes, was redesigned to explore undersea wonders and carry tourists. Me and my wife had the honor of being among these tourists. For our honeymoon, Paige and I visited Hawaii. There, we boarded Tiamat and began our journey, along with 100 other tourists. The first few days were amazing. We saw sharks, whales, shipwrecks, and other marine spectacles, but we were most looking forward to the Mariana Trench. Very few people have visited Earth's deepest known point. Who knew what strange life and geological features we would see? As Tiamat descended, the blue around us grew darker and more eerie, eventually turning pitch black. The submarine's high beam lights turned on, illuminating alien-looking shrimp, fish, and octopuses. The tourists huddled around windows to marvel at the bizarre world. The cabin displays showed the outside temperature and pressure, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1,000 times normal sea level pressure. Paige and I were astonished to see life in such hostile conditions. As we stared out the windows, a commotion broke out several rows back. Paige tapped my shoulder, and I turned around. A group of people were gathered around a tourist lying on the floor near the lavatory. "Somebody help my dad!" The tourist's 12-year-old daughter shrieked. We inched closer to the scene. The tourist had a laceration oozing with black liquid on his right shin. As he sweat and trembled, foam blossomed from his mouth. Seconds later, his arms and legs violently contorted. He abruptly stood up, revealing milky white eyes and bulging veins. Growling, he reared his head at his daughter. We watched as he pounced. In the ensuing chaos, more passengers and crew members went insane. People began screaming and crying. However, we were stuck in a metal tube in an endless black void, 7 miles below the ocean surface. Any kind of help would be many hours away. We wrestled through the crowd, seeing people getting bitten and pummeled. Blood and saliva splattered everywhere. We eventually made it to the emergency escape pod at the submarine's front. However, the latch was jammed. After a tense minute, Paige unjammed it. I looked back and heard a loud cracking sound. One of the windows buckled. A jet of water poured through, becoming more forceful within seconds. I stood there with my mouth agape. "Andrew, we gotta leave now!" Paige yelled at me. We hopped into the pod and started the engine. As we accelerated away, our headlights caught a glimpse of the hull near the busted window caving inward. After 4 hours, we reached the surface. I gave Paige an endearing hug as a rescue team responding to Tiamat's distress signal found us. Just before the team helped us out of the pod, I noticed what appeared to be a blood-stained switchblade, a CDC worker card, and a biohazard symbol-marked glass vial peeking through one of Paige's purse's pockets. My husband's having an affair. He's not even trying to hide it at this point. I see her things in my closet. Her picture is his new home screen, and he goes out with her every Friday instead of me. Well, I simply won't stand for this. He thinks I'm gone, so he scurries out to meet her. They're planning on a picnic on the lake, and he's rowing her out on the boat, my money paid for. She's giggling, a high-pitched screeching sound. He's wearing a brand new suit with a new watch, and he opens a box to give her an actual real diamond necklace. He's never had any of his own. He couldn't even buy our wedding rings, so guess whose money paid for all of that? God, I can't imagine what my parents would say if they knew what he was using their money for. They row out near the other side, next to a willow tree, and I could have just screamed. That's our spot, not theirs. I come up behind her and glare at him as he pales. Really? The nerve of him, kissing her right next to where he buried me. Nevarre Cooper, 1978 to 2019. His name was Nevarre Cooper. There was no foul play that caused his fall from the ship, and there were no witnesses to the accident. Once in the water, he swam with all his might, and the vigor allowed by the panic of his instinct to keep up. But this was impossible. He screamed over and again, "Help! Help me!" to the fullness of his lungs, but no one heard him. The ship did not slow or change course. Finally, he sat bobbing in the water, watching the lights grow dimmer, his face flickering, his body swishing around, looking for land where the night sky met the ocean, but there was none. He did not face death well, not in the way a deer might lay down in the victor's jaws and accept its fate. He considered every possible strategy, such as trying to float on his back for the longest possible time, swimming to the boat's direction at a steady pace, trying to determine where land might be, looking for jetsam to cling to. But after cycling through these hopeless options, a pitiful whimper started to rise up from his chest. Without control, it quickly broke into a guttural sob. He screamed and wept tears and mucus that mixed with the salty ocean. He was thinking about his children, his young girls who would miss him and always wonder where Daddy went. This in particular was the most searing of pain for him. He took the Lord's name in vain, crying out, "God! Jesus!" as he wept, in common curse words like fuck. After 2 hours, becoming thoroughly depleted, Mr. Cooper was nearing his body's limit, but he did spastically attempt to reject death once more, thinking not to give up, as long as there's an ounce of life left in me, or something along those lines. He curried power to thrash about in the waters for a few seconds longer before finally succumbing and falling beneath the surface. Some 20 feet under, he watched the last of the air release from his lungs, the bubbles rising to the surface. It was poignant, like a ghostly figure, a symbol of his very life drifting away from him. A memory then arose of his 2 young girls happily dancing with him during a gleeful moment of play. This brought a great bout of agony, causing his body to retch and sucking in ocean water to fill his lungs. His vision went black, and soon all that remained was a soulless, drifting carcass. I hope that this recounting of Mr. Cooper's terror finds you well, and will leave you sated, my Lord Abaddon. I try to include some more colorful elements, as you have wished, without venturing too far into interpretation. Furthermore, and as always, I assure you that nothing was done to ease the man's suffering. I stand awaiting further assignments. In your bondage, nameless, number 486-028-468. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel. Your generosity means the world to me. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness or Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank you all for your support, your kindness, and your encouragement. I appreciate it so very much. Until next time.